Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Sherry West, and I'm the founder and CEO of Live Girl, and I want to start by thanking the beautiful New Canaan Library for hosting us tonight in celebration of Women's History Month. So thank you, Mickey and New Canaan Library. For those who don't know, Live Girl, we are a New Canaan-founded and Connecticut-based women's leadership nonprofit. We serve thousands of girls across the state annually through our free of charge leadership development, mental wellness, and mentorship programs, as well as our career readiness programming. And we celebrate Women's History Month very loudly because only 1 in 4 of the historical figures that our students learn about in school are women. And we need to tell more women's stories, and our girls need to know those stories to know what's possible for them. So we are very honored to feature one of those incredible stories here tonight. We are featuring Haley Cohen Gilliland, and she's a journalist, author, and director of the Yale Journalism Initiative. Her new book, A Flower Traveled in My Blood, was named a top book of 2025 by the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, Time Magazine, and many others. It illuminates the courageous grandmothers who refuse to stay silent in the face of dictatorship and loss. And interviewing her will be Live Girl advisor Heather Cabot, also a best-selling author and former ABC News correspondent. Heather has her 4th nonfiction book, Indian School Road, coming out in the spring of 2027. So we hope you'll all come back then for that book discussion. But for now, we'll welcome Haley and Heather to the stage.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, New Canaan Library. Thank you, Live Girl. And it's so great to be here again. I'm so excited to be here with Haley. Thank you so much for being here tonight, especially in honor of Women's History Month.
Thank you for being here, Heather, and thank all of you for being here. It really means a lot doing these types of events where I get to actually engage with people who have read or plan to read the book, have been my favorite part of the publishing process. So thank you for coming in off of this beautiful night when you could have been doing anything else other than sitting inside.
Well, it's such a privilege to get a chance to sit down and talk with you, because not only was this book riveting and so important, and the storytelling was amazing, but it's a story that not many people in this country know. So I think just for folks who haven't read the book yet, can you just kind of give us just a thumbnail sketch of what is the book about? Who is the book about?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I don't want anyone to feel bad if they don't already know the story, because that was me 15 years ago when I first moved to Argentina. So this book is about the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, who are a group of grandmothers in Argentina who, since the last dictatorship in Argentina in the 1970s and 1980s, have very bravely been working together to find their grandchildren who were stolen from them during that military dictatorship. And they banded together when the dictatorship was still ongoing at immense risk to their own lives, and essentially transformed themselves into detectives. They donned disguises. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more. There are some fun stories. But in service of finding their grandchildren, they were able to change legislation and lobby the UN into creating new policies. And they even pioneered new forms of genetic testing in service of finding these stolen grandchildren. So that's the basic outlines of the book, but I'm sure we'll go into some of the historical context, because it's hard to...
So I think we should start there too, because I was one of those people also. I did not know the history myself. And you spent a good portion, the beginning of the book, really setting the stage and kind of putting, what the abuelas are up against, you put it in context for the reader in a way that I think for people who, I mean, it's the 70s and 80s, and I was a little girl then. I didn't remember any of that. I didn't know about any of that history. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that? Give us the backdrop.
Absolutely. So Argentina, between 1930 and 1976, when the dictatorship that we're going to be talking most about happened, so between those years, 1930 and 1976, there were 6 military coups in Argentina. And as you can imagine, it was ushered in a period of just absolute tumult, both economically, socially, the constant swinging between civilian governments and military governments sowed a lot of social polarization, to the point where in 1975, political violence had really gotten out of control because there were these left-wing groups that had sprouted in opposition to what they saw as kind of the creep of autocracy in Argentina. And then there were these right-wing paramilitary death squads that were actually tacitly supported by the military and by the government. And these groups were clashing really furiously to the point where in 1975, a bomb was going off in Argentina every 3 hours, and a political assassination was happening every 5 hours. So it was absolute bedlam, to the point where much of the Argentine population in 1975, early 1976, not only expected another military coup, because many of them had already lived through 5 over the past decades, and those, I should have mentioned, were sometimes repressive culturally, but they didn't tend to be that bloody. And so there were a lot of people in Argentina who not only expected the military to take control again, but actually really rooted for another coup to restore order because things had just spun really out of control. What they didn't fully anticipate is that the coup in 1976, the leaders of this coup, had a much broader and more sinister plan, which was to essentially purge the country of anyone with ideas that they deemed, quote unquote, subversive. And that did, of course, include members of the left-wing revolutionary groups, but they took a much wider view of what subversion meant. And that definition also included, journalists and artists and poets and priests who were ministering to the poor, nuns who were ministering to the poor. So it was this extremely wide dragnet that the military government immediately targeted once they took power in March of 1976. Actually, the 50th anniversary just passed last week of the 1976 coup. So the military government immediately started to target this wide group of people. And among the people who were caught up in this purge were 500 women who happened to be pregnant at the time of their abductions, or have young children who were kind of captured along with them. And the military government, as I said, wanted to purge these people from the country, but they wanted to do so quietly enough and with enough plausible deniability that fellow Argentines did not revolt. And so instead of outrightly killing people, Argentina is responsible for coining the term to disappear. And essentially what that meant was they killed people, but they did it in ways that left very little evidence. And so this is very dark, but one of the main ways that the government disappeared people was by loading them into airplanes and pushing them alive into the river that runs next to Buenos Aires and sometimes the Atlantic Ocean, which is a little bit further out. And so to bring it back to the book, 500 women who happened to be pregnant at the time of their abductions were swept up in this brutal dragnet, and essentially they were held until they gave birth in detention, and then the new mothers were quietly disappeared, sometimes in these death flights, and their babies were given to other families, and many times those families were related to the regime. So they were police families and military families that the military felt had the correct Argentine values, the values that they were trying to reinstill in the country. And so
this is where the grandmothers come in, because the story is really about how they hunt down where these children ended up, where their grandchildren ended up. So, I mean, you're talking about this repressive regime, this time of immense fear. How did the abuelas meet each other? How did they come together? Can you tell us how that happened?
Yeah, so as you said, it was terror completely reigned in Argentina. Terror and silence, because all of the institutions that would normally hold a government to account were either complicit or too terrorized to do that job. So the media did not report on disappearances at all for years and years in Argentina. The church supported, much of the elite of the church in Argentina tacitly supported the military government. And so these institutions that would normally hold power to account were not doing that in this case. And as the months went on and droves of Argentines started to disappear, what happened was the only people brave enough, and some people would say crazy enough, at the time to stand up were the mothers of the children, or the mothers basically of the people who were disappearing, because it was a lot of young people. Yeah. The mothers and grandmothers. And how they initially met was that a couple months after the dictatorship started, mothers started recognizing each other in lines for government offices that they were waiting for, where they would go to beg for information. And these were always fruitless visits. The government was never going to give them any information. They were aware, dimly at least, that the government was actually responsible for the disappearances of their children, but they had nowhere else to go, so they still would line up outside of the Ministry of Interior and jails and police stations to beg for any glint of information. And over time, they started recognizing each other from these lines. And one grandmother even has this incredible line about how they learned to recognize each other from, they learned to recognize police that were kind of undercover in their midst, but they could just as easily recognize each other by sort of the anxiety and anguish in each other's faces. And at one point, one of the mothers in these lines got so fed up at the futility of the exercise that they were going through, that she stood up so that everyone could hear her, and she was very tiny, but she made herself very tall, and said, we need to stop doing this. We need to stop coming here. They're not giving us any information. What we need to do is go to the Plaza de Mayo, which is this iconic square in the very heart of Buenos Aires, in front of the presidential palace, and we need to go there and we need to demand information and refuse to stop gathering there until we get it. And so thus were launched these weekly marches of mothers and grandmothers in the Plaza de Mayo. And over time, they grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And the grandmothers began to recognize that while they were mothers and they desperately wanted to find out what had happened to their children, they also had this separate mission, which was, in a way, they realized kind of a more practical mission, because many of the mothers eventually recognized that probably their children were not alive. So it became more of an act of defiance and a political act to stand in the plaza and protest. The grandmothers held out hope that their grandchildren, those babies that had been stolen, were still alive. And so they determined that they should start to meet separately to strategize about how to find them.
So one of the things that I found really compelling is, and I don't want to give away too much of the book, but they do track down some of these grandchildren, and they have to make some really wrenching decisions about what to do. Do you take a child who has no idea what's happened and is happy and seems to be settled with this new family, or how do you reveal what the truth is? How do you make that decision? And there are several different moments in the book where they're wrestling with that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think the grandmothers always imagined that finding their grandchildren would be the most difficult part of their mission. And it was extremely difficult. I don't want to kind of just skim over that. They, as I said, they had to convert themselves into detectives. They would go into government registries and comb through every single birth certificate for the years of 1976, 1977, 1978, looking for hallmarks of fake birth certificates, which in Argentina tended to be home births. Those were very rare in that time. Home births signed by a military or police doctor, that was a real red flag, and that was an indication that they should focus in on those cases. So they did all of this, archival documentary work. They, when they thought that they had zeroed in on a grandchild that was possibly one of theirs, they would put on disguises. They would put on wigs and dress up in different ways, just so that they could continue to kind of walk up and down the street to wait for the school bus to drop off that child every day without arousing suspicion. But meanwhile, they were trying to get a glimpse of, okay, does this child have a birth, a scar on their left calf? Because I know that Danielle, when he was taken, he had, a scar on his left calf. And the other thing was, many of the grandmothers had never met their grandchildren. These grandchildren were taken when they were still in utero. And so they didn't even know what sex they were looking for, certainly not scars or birthmarks, eye color, nothing of the sort. And so we'll get into the genetic aspect later, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so finding the grandchildren was incredibly difficult. But ultimately, they did. They started to find grandchildren. They started to recover grandchildren. But they were faced, especially when the grandchildren were minors, with these really wrenching decisions about what was best for these children. Because, while many of these grandchildren were found in military and police homes, and in those cases almost unilaterally, the grandmothers fought for custody really ferociously because they felt that even if the grandchild was happy in that situation, those people had knowingly stolen those babies, and they were potentially complicit in really serious dictatorship-era crimes, so they could not conscience leaving them in those homes. There were cases where children were adopted legally. They were abandoned and then adopted by families who had no idea of their origins. And those tended to be really tricky situations.
The children dropped off at the park, or
exactly.
So many different examples where they were snatched and just sort of left and then adopted and had no idea.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was really interesting, and I mentioned this to you earlier, is the fact that, abuelas, women of a certain age, typically, in our society, oftentimes women of a certain age are kind of invisible or made to feel invisible. And I was wondering, how do you think these particular women kind of leverage that? How did they use that to their advantage in the sense that society might not have, necessarily watched what they were doing? Even though they were very vocal, but with the disguises and all of the things that they did, how did they kind of work that to their advantage?
Well, they absolutely leaned into that. And it is interesting that you bring up the dichotomy, because they had their public displays of protest every week. And those were meant to garner attention. They wanted people to look at them. But then the rest of the time, they really used their cultural camouflage as women of a certain age. They were in their 50s and 60s. They were mothers and grandmothers, to their advantage to work as effectively as they possibly could. And the forms that this took were sometimes quite humorous. So, when they were starting out and they didn't yet have their own headquarters, they would meet in cafes as a group of women, and they would pretend to be celebrating a birthday. And so they would bring a box that was completely empty, but it was nicely wrapped and tied up with ribbon. They would bring candles to put on the chocotorta or whatever they would order at the cafe. And sometimes they would even bring knitting needles and some of them were really prolific knitters, but some of them had no idea, the difference between I don't knit, but like a cable and a purl. I think those are knitting strokes. But they would just lie the knitting needles next to their cups to lean into this image of, we are harmless. We are just little old ladies celebrating a birthday knitting. And so they did that, or other times it kind of took higher stakes forms. There was one instance in which two of the grandmothers traveled to Brazil to consult these archives that a human rights organization in Brazil had been able to compile. Brazil also was under a dictatorship at this time, but it was less brutal than Argentina's, so it was the source of a lot of political refugees. People would flee there and then share information, and so the grandmothers went to consult these archives and found what was immensely powerful for them, these records of births that had happened in clandestine detention centers in Argentina. So basically records of births of their grandchildren that revealed birth dates and sexes and possibly families that had taken them as well. And so they needed a way to get this information back to Argentina to really process it, but they couldn't just walk in with their notes through the military checkpoints. And so what they did instead was they bought several boxes of Brazilian truffles, chocolates, and they left some untouched, but they ate some of the chocolates out of the other one. Tough job. And then crumpled up their notes that they'd taken into small balls that they wrapped in the chocolate wrappers, and then put those in their suitcases. And when they went through the security checkpoint in Argentina, they took the boxes that were intact and started offering chocolates to their equivalent of TSA agents. And they were waved immediately through because they just looked like little old ladies that were carrying chocolate home to their families. So they really recognized that they were going to be overlooked and underestimated, and that they were just fine with that because they could work a lot more effectively that way.
They had a tremendous amount of chutzpah, as we might say. I mean, they were so ingenious. I love the title, especially when I learned the origin of it, which you reveal in the book. Can you talk about the title, what it means, where it came from?
Yeah, so I guess maybe I'll talk a little bit about the ways in which the abuelas pioneered new forms of genetics, because that ties into the title. Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, many of the grandmothers had not met their grandchildren when they were taken. And so pretty early on in their mission of working together, they recognized that they were going to need to turn to science to help develop a tool that would be objective enough to both identify their grandchildren. These grandchildren they had never met, so they don't know what they look like. They don't know, their genders or anything about them. And also something convincing enough that it would, allow a court of law to restore those children to their proper families. And so they began traveling around the world trying to find a scientist who could help them come up with a grand paternity test. But this was the late 1970s, early 1980s, so actually DNA was not available yet. DNA testing was not readily available. And so for a couple of years, they were met with just universal shrugs by everyone that they sought help from. People said, yeah, we know how to do paternity, but no one has ever done a grand paternity test without blood from a parent. And in this case, in Argentina, the parents were usually disappeared, so they did not have access to that genetic information. So this went on for a couple of years, and the grandmothers started to get really disheartened. And then finally, as the dictatorship was unraveling, they were put in touch with an American geneticist who, I'm actually curious if anyone's heard of her, because I feel like she should be a household name. Oh, you've heard of her. Okay, great. You know where I'm going. But her name was Dr. Mary Claire King. And the reason that we all should have heard of her is because, first of all, she was responsible for proving how closely related we are to chimpanzees. That was kind of her first discovery that put her on the map. But the discovery that she's more iconic for is that she discovered the BRCA1 gene. And so she has saved just hundreds of thousands of women's lives through that discovery. The grandmothers got in touch with her before that discovery, but she was already, a renowned geneticist in the U.S. And she was also the perfect person to work with them because she she had grown up she was a graduate student in Berkeley in the 1960s and had been very socially active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. So she had a very strong social conscience. She had actually worked in Chile in 1973 when the dictatorship took power there. And so she had witnessed firsthand sort of the horror that a dictatorship could wreak on a civilization. And then finally, her only daughter was exactly the same age as the grandchildren that the abuelas were searching for. And so she immediately felt a drive to help them and an affinity to their cause, because she said, had she been born in Buenos Aires and not in Chicago, probably, she might have been disappeared for her beliefs, and her daughter could have been among those who was stolen. And so Dr. Mary Claire King, with the abuelas, pioneered this entirely new form of genetic testing that allowed them to prove their connection to their grandchildren without any blood from their children. And over time, the method that they used to do this testing was refined and kind of empowered until ultimately in the 1990s, they started using a genetic element called mitochondrial DNA, which maybe you all are familiar with. But what's really amazing about mitochondrial DNA is it's only passed down by mothers. And it's passed down almost entirely unchanged. So it's a really powerful tool when it comes to tracing ancestry. And for the situation of the abuelas, it was incredibly powerful, because if you found a grandchild and a grandmother through the maternal line that shared the exact same mitochondrial DNA, the odds of that being a genetic match were almost 100%. They were very, very high. And so the title, to bring it back to the title derives actually from an Argentine poem by a poet named Juan Gelman. And Gelman wrote this poem before the dictatorship, but actually his grandchild would be among those who was stolen during the dictatorship. So his life collided with the cause of the abuelas, because his son and daughter-in-law were disappeared and his grandchild was taken. So he had this connection to the abuelas. And then as I was reading his poetry, this line, so a flower traveled in my blood, really just struck me as a powerful encapsulation of the way that the grandmothers captured the power of genetics and the power of motherhood and maternity in order to reconnect with their grandchildren.
Yeah, and I think this is a line from the poem. It's also the title of the chapter where you reveal it. It's a bird lived in me. And I just, as a mother, it really resonated with me. And so that brings me to my next question for you, is you worked on this book for a really long time, but you didn't actually sit down with Rosa until you were a mother yourself. And so I'm curious, you first got interested in the story in like 2011, right? But you worked on it all of these years, and then you finally went back and met with her, and now here you are experiencing something that you could relate to in a totally different way than you would have before with her. I guess, how did that change the way you approached the story? Did it change the way you framed it, the way you went about it?
Yeah, I don't think that you need to be a parent to understand the abuela story and to understand their courage and the incredible power in their movement. I think for me, it really changed everything. So I did learn of this story in 2011. So I moved to Argentina after graduating college in 2011 and ended up working for 4 years in the country as a correspondent for The Economist. And I learned of the abuelas during that time and became really fascinated by them. But I didn't actually immediately start working on this book because the longer I lived in Argentina, the more I got lulled into this false sense that everybody in the world already knew their story. So it really wasn't until years and years later, until moving back to the States and actually getting pregnant for the first time with my oldest daughter, that their story came rushing back to me, and I started talking to friends about it. and many of my friends were history majors, as was I. And at that point, I realized that many of them were not familiar with this history, did not know who the grandmothers were. And that was what really sparked my desire to start the book. But I, officially started working on the book in 2021 when I was 6 months pregnant, and basically...
So 10 years after you first had heard about it.
Yes, yeah.
I thought and we talked a little bit earlier about the extensive notes in the back, and the storytelling is so dramatic and compelling and descriptive, and yet just the way you put it all together, and then realizing the depth of the archival research, the interviews, all the stuff that you had to do. Can you talk a little bit about the process? How did you kind of attack it? How did you start?
Yeah, starting was very intimidating because I knew that I wanted to capture the sweep of 50 years of Argentine history in a fairly compact, I mean, some people would argue that it probably wasn't compact enough and I could have cut some things, but...
No, I thought the chapters were, it really moved.
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you for reading the notes. That means a lot.
Honestly, I would definitely read the notes because it'll give you a real insight into how she put this together. I mean, even like some of the dialogue, like when Patricia has her son, and I mean, what she says, and I was like, how did she know exactly what she said? And I went back and I looked. I mean, it was really, it's remarkable how meticulous you are in your reporting and how you, but also, you know, it's one thing to do great research, but it's a whole other thing to be an amazing storyteller. And the way you set the scenes and the way you put it all together and you kept the suspense going, I thought it was masterful.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think the depth and the hopefully propulsive nature of the story go hand in hand, because I think whenever I felt stuck during the writing process, my mantra was just go deeper, and this story, this history, this is a real, it's not a story, I mean, it's a history, it's real. But this history is so incredible that if I can just find out what really happened, the book is going to write itself. You know, it's still going to be hard because writing's hard, but the story will kind of be mapped out. But I guess, you know, the process, so the book took almost 5 years. It involved a lot of original reporting, so interviewing the surviving grandmothers, interviewing the grandchildren that they had recovered. I spent a lot of time with Dr. Mary Claire King, which was a great honor. She, I think now is 79, either 78 or 79, has more energy than anyone that I've ever come across in my entire life. I mean, our shortest interview was 3.5 hours. There were no bathroom breaks, no water breaks, no food breaks, to the point where the next interview, I kind of came prepared as though I was running a marathon. I had a giant water bottle. I baked her a banana bread so that I could eat some. Yeah, that interview lasted 9 hours. And I think she was ready to keep going, and I was ready to pass out. So I spent a lot of time with her. You know, talked, of course, to a lot of historians and people to kind of help set the context. But then the other thing that I was very, very lucky to get to access with this book, and I didn't know that this would exist, and I think this is another indication of the grandmother's courage, were just deep archival sources. And one of those archives was the grandmother's institutional archive. And why I say that that's a reflection of courage is because even documenting what they were doing during the dictatorship would have been immensely risky, because if anyone found those documents, you know, they would have been very easily traceable. Their addresses would have been on there, exactly what their strategy would have been on there. And so the fact that they captured, you know, they clipped out so many newspaper clippings, they documented exactly what they were doing, they took notes when they went on trips. The fact that they documented all that was incredibly courageous, and also so important for me in being able to reconstruct, especially the early days of their history.
Right, I mean, being able to actually piece together moment by moment, like the room where Patricia delivered, and, you know, exactly what the table and what she said, and I mean, just all of, there's so many different scenes in the book like that. I'm getting a 5 minutes, so I think one other question I wanted to ask you before we go to questions real quick was, I also really loved that there, well, I guess when you first embarked on this, did you think that this was going to be a story about female friendship too? Because I feel like among the abuelas, and I'm just thinking Women's History Month as well. I mean, there's a sisterhood there. Was that something that you thought you were going to find? And I guess what can we learn? What can we take away from the way they supported each other through all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to write this book without imposing any ideology that I might have on it. I tried to come at it from a really journalistic, neutral place. But I do feel like there are a couple of lessons that do just kind of spring out of the book naturally. And one of them was this lesson about the power of groups of women in particular. So these were women that individually had none of the traditional markings of power. They didn't have money, they didn't have political influence, and alone they were really vulnerable. But they recognized that by working together and pooling their resources, pooling their intelligence, and also just physically standing together in a place where they could make themselves more visible and harder to thus disappear, that they could actually transform themselves into a collective unit that was incredibly powerful, and in fact so powerful that it helped topple the dictatorship eventually and help them to claw back what was stolen from them in the form of their grandchildren. So I think that was one of the lessons that just sort of presents itself naturally. And then the other one I think is about truth, and maybe this is just as a journalist, but I think the other lesson is, the dictatorship fought really aggressively to bury the truth, to bury the bodies, to bury the evidence. And I think the relentlessness of the grandmothers shows that if there are people who continue to fight for the truth to surface, it will eventually come out. You can't bury it forever. So I feel like those are the two universal lessons.
Yeah, I love that. I think we have time for some questions now.
If you raise your hand, I'll come to you with the microphone.
Thank you so much. So I just have a quick question about, I think to your point that it's beautifully written and a powerful story, but also deeply reported. I guess the question, because it's really dense with the material at the end and also the details you talked about. So I was wondering why you decided to include at the end, and also through the reporting, so much of this detail that is attributable. Of course, we would want that, but what I'm wondering if there is a deeper thought, because you did study history, because the story has not, even though it's known in Argentina, I'm wondering if there has been an impact or a consequence that may come from the very detail of a story that even in Argentina is known, and what you think about what may come from having created really a book that future generations can look to as a history source about what happened.
Thank you so much, Anne. I think it wasn't that conscious a part of my process. I think I was a history major. I just really enjoy deep research, and if I was allowed to continue researching for the rest of my days until I was as old as the grandmothers, and my publisher did not say you need to actually give us the book now, I probably would still just be researching it. So part of it is personal preference. I think also part of what, so one thing that hasn't come up actually is that the book is about all of the grandmothers. It's about their movement, but it's really told through the story of one family. And I don't want to say too much about what happens in their story, because I do hope that you'll read the book. But I think I recently interacted with someone I was able to go back to Argentina for the 50th anniversary of the coup and interact with somebody in the family. And what they said was that the reason they were willing to speak with me, and I know that in your own reporting, building trust with sources and rapport with sources is a cornerstone of what makes you so amazing. He mentioned that the reason he was willing to go as deep in our interviews was because I would sometimes show up at them with documents about his family that he didn't even have or hadn't seen, or I would have court recordings or things that just made clear that I had really done my research before asking him to share a really sensitive, sensitive part of his history. So I think maybe partially that's reflected. But I think, I do hope, when I was in Argentina, this came up. I think, once again, the dictatorship in the 70s and 80s, the goal was to disappear people. It was to disappear evidence. It was to disappear that period of history. And so I think there is, and I felt this way the first time I held the book in my hands before it came out, I hope there's a real power in writing it all down and, putting it out there permanently.
Hi, I'm right here. Yeah. I just wanted to say, first of all, that the book was fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
Wow, I couldn't stop. It was really fantastic. It was so well done. Two things that I sort of got left with, and I know we're not giving away spoilers, but I do want to know or sort of get your headspace about two things. And I guess first is the sort of historical arc of the abuelas is they weren't exactly, welcome with open arms, even after there was sort of a reconciliation with, or an admission rather, of what had happened, right? And I feel like maybe it came full circle with like Kirchner, did I say that correctly? But it came a little bit full circle. So that was interesting to me that they sort of had this staying power. I don't know, I guess it's like something about the female spirit, also moms. And then the second thing that really struck me, and I'm not even a journalist, but I found myself not being able to really take a position on the abuelas versus the grandchildren. There was a lot of sort of internal conflict with some of the grandkids anyway, because they were raised in these homes and that was all that they ever knew. And so I find myself, saying, oh, this is terrible, and like, no, the justice must be served. And then all of a sudden I listen to one of the grandkids and I'm like, oh, shoot, I get it. So I guess anyway, I was just, interested. As a reporter, I understand that you're there to tell a story, but I imagine that all of these thoughts may have entered your mind as well. And maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, first of all, thank you for reading the book and engaging with it so deeply. To dig into the second theme first, I think my goal was to inject the complexity into the book and to not shy away from that. I do think, the grandmothers are heroic and their courage was heroic, but I wasn't trying to write a hagiography of them. I wasn't trying to shy away from some of the controversies in their history. If you read the book, you will find out that there were fissures in the group and kind of internal fighting sometimes. These were humans. They were not, demigods. So there was fighting, and then there were, I think one of the more controversial areas in recent history is that there have been a lot of fights over compulsory DNA testing and who gets to choose whether someone finds out about their identity or not. So especially, in more recent times when the grandmothers that the grandchildren that the grandmothers are seeking are actually adults, they've had to deal with situations where there are grandchildren whom they suspect of being their relations who actively resist finding out about their identities for years. I mentioned a story in the book that actually turns kind of humorous, but where one suspected grandchild fought DNA testing for 10 years. And he would do things like, once they developed the ability to test DNA off of toothbrushes and personal items, he would get personal items from his friends and stuff his gym bag with plants so that when somebody came to pick up his things to say, we have to test your DNA now, he would kind of hand the bag off and be like, good luck with that. And that went on for 10 years, and he really, really resisted testing, and yet the grandmothers persisted because, according to their perspective, the right to identity actually belongs not only to an individual, but actually a family and a society, especially in a place like Argentina, where the reason that they were having to look for someone's identity to begin with stems from these awful crimes that had never been, properly adjudicated. And so there's a lot of complexity in the book, and I really didn't want to shy away from that. And part of it is I didn't want to inject my opinion on some of these issues because I wanted you to form your own. But there were some issues in here that I didn't have clarity around, and maybe that comes through as well because they're really complicated. And then in the first question you mentioned, just the fact that the abuelas have not always been embraced, and in fact are living through a moment right now in Argentina. I don't know, there was a New York Times piece this week that you probably read about how they're extremely in a tense moment with the current president and administration. I think there have been constant swings since the dictatorship of governments who have supported them in their mission, governments who have opposed them in their mission, and they have just persisted through it all. I mean, I think they survived the dictatorship, and they're not going to be daunted by an administration kind of yanking funding or support. But I think both the government and society has gone through swings of viewing them in a more sympathetic light and ascribing to more of this theory that in order for the country to progress and thrive and move forward, that part of Argentina's history should be kind of shunted to the side and let go of. So I don't know if that answered your questions, but they were both very good questions.
That's certainly very relevant here and everywhere anymore.
Yeah.
Was there one more?
Okay.
Were you at all surprised by the abuela's ability to travel to places to gather information? I was struck by what they were able to do in terms of traveling to get people to assist them.
Definitely. So during the dictatorship in particular, because they could not look for help domestically from the government and civil society was completely repressed, the grandmothers were able to travel internationally quite widely in a bid to try to seek funding and support from groups like Amnesty International, from kind of ecclesiastical groups outside in the world. I was really surprised by it because, once again, these were not women with a lot of resources, but they were incredibly intrepid and scrappy, and they would pool together their savings, their husbands' pensions, anything they possibly could. And it wasn't the whole group, the whole gaggle of grandmothers that was traveling together. It was generally one or two. But they once again relied on working as a collective to be able to empower those trips. But it was really surprising, and I think once again a reflection of their relentlessness, the fact that they made that happen.
Anybody else? Was there somebody raising their hand? Okay. While I'm walking there, I just want to bring your attention to the fact that Elm Street Books is in the house tonight. So after our Q&A period, Haley will be over at the book table signing books.
It's been 50 years now, and I understand the abuelas are still meeting every week in the plaza. And I just wondered how successful they were. How many children did they find? If you could talk about that a little bit. And also, it seems as though they must have been recognized and embraced at some point because of the scarves that are carved in the plaza all around.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think, so the scarves are an allusion to kind of headgear that both the grandmothers and the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo began to wear in the 1970s in the dictatorship to identify themselves. And actually they started by wearing cloth diapers, white cloth diapers, in homage to their children. And then once they were worried about losing the only mementos, physical mementos that they had of their children, they switched to handkerchiefs, and these handkerchiefs have since become iconic. kind of associated with the power of the movement worldwide. So certainly, I mean, I think both the mothers and grandmothers are much more recognizable worldwide now and are recognizable figures in Argentina. Just how much they are accepted and embraced has swung depending on who's in government. And then in terms of the success of the movement, so one of the things that was very important to me is in the back kind of appendixes, there's a list of all of the grandchildren that have been found by the abuelas at this point, and also a list of those grandchildren who have yet to be found. And so to answer your question concretely, they have located 140 out of the estimated 500 stolen babies, and their work continues very much today. And many of the grandmothers, sadly, have passed away at this point. There are only a few, really two, who are still active in the movement, and they're in their older 80s and 90s. The main subject of the book, Rosa Roisenblatt, who just passed away this past year, she passed away at 106, but she was active until the very end. And I think the fact that they all tend to live this long is a sign of just, they're indefatigable, and their mission, I think, empowered them to live really long lives. But they, the grandchildren that they have found have now taken up the mantle to find their peers. And so even though the grandmothers are sadly passing away, the mission is very much ongoing, and they found someone just last year. I have no doubt that they will find somebody, sometime soon.
Haley, thank you so much. This has been such a treat. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, New Canaan Library. Thank you, Live Girl. Please join us over there at the table.
I get the last word to thank you. Thank you to everyone for celebrating Women's History Month with us. Heather, thank you so much for the excellent interview, the insightful questions, and Haley, especially for writing down, capturing this important story that we all need to learn from, especially in the current moment. So thank you. And just a reminder, Haley will be signing books with Elm Street Books over there, and we also have more information on Live Girl. So thank you all. Happy Women's History Month. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.